Everybody can settle in. We're going to play by House rules today. We were going to start with Congressman Hoyer, but he's not here yet, so we're going to start with Congressman Engel. I want to welcome everyone. Oh, Hoyer, okay, great. I want to welcome everyone today to a meeting that is both an act of remembering, a kind of collective act of mourning for Boris Nemtsov, but also an act of solidarity with those in Russia who are fighting in the face of immense danger and repression for a better society based on the rule of law, where human rights and human dignity are respected and protected. I think that what we're doing is consistent with the spirit of Boris Nemtsov, that we are future at this meeting and regretting what has happened. Russian Democrats have not been beaten and frightened into silence. Murder Nemtsov. Rather, this killing seems to have created a new unity within the Russian opposition. People are showing real determination to coordinate strategies to fulfill a better and more democratic Russia. This was Nemtsov's vision in contrast to Putin of a state where information is used as a weapon. Witnesses are considered to be national traitors and part of a fifth column. We know that. And nationalist hatred is fomented as an instrument of state power. This meeting, like NED itself, is a partnership between Congress and the NED. I want to thank the offices of Congressman Hoyer and Engel and their staffs for all the work they did in putting on this meeting. And of course, I want to thank the NED team. Before we get started, I want to just make sure that everyone has silenced the cell phones. And I want to note that on Twitter can join the conversation by using the hashtag NEDEvents. And I also just want to note that the posters you have in the program in the room are the same ones that were carried in the memorial march that took place in Moscow on March 1st, 2 days after the assassination of Boris Nemtsov. It's now my great pleasure to introduce the Democratic whip, Steny Hoyer, who has been the chair of the Helsinki Commission, ranking member of the commission in the House, and great defender of human rights. And I'm also proud to say that he's a former NED board member. Congressman Hoyer.
Thank you very much, Carl. I'm so pleased to be here. Frankly, I have not been a member of the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe since I became the whip some 12 years ago. I'm the whip again. I was the majority leader. Those were what I refer to as the good old days. But I am pleased to be here. Senator Cardin, who is my dear friend, I understand is on the program. I'm not sure he'll get over here. But I am so pleased to be here, Carl, with you and with so many people who have continued to raise high the banner of human rights, political rights, civic rights. As you know, the Helsinki Final Act, which will celebrate its anniversary this August, having been signed in 1975 in Helsinki, had three, which was security, one of which was economic and environment, and the third of which was human rights. And the fact of the matter is, for the most part, there were a lot of bilaterals on security. There were many multilaterals on economic relations between nations. But there really was not a laser focus on human rights. And the Helsinki Commission and its efforts and the Helsinki Final Act and the national organizations related to Helsinki filled that gap in many ways. So I'm pleased to be here with you. I want to thank the National Endowment for hosting today's events, which I hope will result meaningful discussions not only about the current state of affairs in Russia, but also the universal strength of freedom. And the brazen and cold-blooded assassination of Boris Nemtsov on February 27th shocked the conscience of the world and laid bare the danger posed by a Russia that renounces the rule of law, detains peaceful activists, and kills its own opposition leaders. When I served as chairman of the Helsinki Commission during the period of transition at the end of the Cold War, 85 to 90, I used to tell my dear friend Donnie Fasel, who preceded me as chairman, that he was chairman from 1985 and nothing happened. I became chairman, the Soviet Union went to perestroika and glasnost, the Soviet Union fell, and Donnie would tell me, well, you're so good, which of course was not true at all. But the Helsinki Final Act played a significant role in that because it gave intellectual underpinning to the premise of the Helsinki activists. It gave a sense that speaking up was legitimate. And of course, the Soviets had signed on to those words, which they, of course, thought would be meaningless and without effect. And Václav Havel came and spoke to a joint session of Congress. We just established a bust in the capital of the United States for Václav Havel, and said to us how effective the Helsinki Final Act, those words were to give justification. And one of the things we did in the Helsinki Final Act was raise people and issues out of anonymity. When I first started going to the Soviet Union, to Moscow, Kiev, Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, I was somewhat concerned that I would raise the names of people, thinking perhaps that would put them in danger's focus. In fact, I was told by so many of them, Yuli Edelstein being one, who's now the Speaker of the Knesset, but who was a reviewsnik, along with Natan Sharansky and Sakharov and Elena Bonner and others. No, raising people, focusing on them and on their issues is absolutely essential. The driving principle, government treats its own citizens, will result in how it treats others. Prior to the Second World War, of course, and we heard the Soviets in particular, but there are other nations who speak of this as well, that what we do with our own citizens is none of the rest of the world's business. The Second World War and the Holocaust disabused us of that premise, and that premise that we are, in fact, our brother's keeper was put into the Helsinki Final Act. Nemtsov's murder demonstrates how relevant that principle is today. Just a few hours before his murder, Mr. Nemtsov was interviewed by Newsweek and said that Russia was, and I quote, drowning. He lamented both the country's economic decline under Putin and the decline in its people's freedom. In a statement made all the more among the last, Mr. Nemtsov issued this indictment, I quote, "He implanted Magnitsky in the pursuit of justice. It was, of course, my friend Ben Cardin who offered, and we saw adopted, the Magnitsky Amendment. Because of people like them, and some of the people I mentioned who led during the Soviet time, I believe the forces of freedom will prevail. Voice, with our focus, with our activity, with activity that NED has displayed over the decades. Victory, free and democratic Ukraine, which will accomplish exactly what Putin fears another neighbor nation, with Western values, and an example of a successful democracy. President Poroshenko is pushing reforms that will help place Ukraine on a path toward the European Union. We are fortunate to have an outstanding panel here this morning. Thank you all for being here. More importantly, thanks for what you do every day and over the years to raise the issues so critically important. I hope that today's discussion will serve to honor Mr. Nemtsov's memory and his legacy by exploring ways to promote his vision of achieving the freedoms and brighter futures that the Russian people deserve. For me, I will continue to speak out in Congress for policies that stand up.
It's in Latin America, the Balkans, the Middle East, and Africa. Congressman Eliot Engel.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Carl, for your very kind introduction, and the National Endowment of Democracy for bringing us honor the memory of Boris Nemtsov and to on the goal he gave his life for a democratic and prosperous Russia. I last saw Mr. Nemtsov in the summer of 2013, right in this building, when he was in Washington to testify before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He came to and told me he was the opposition to Putin, and I laughed and said, "Well, I hope you win." And we had a good laugh together, and you could tell that he was a very gregarious person who was really committed. Just someone that I was really just taken aback by him, very impressed with him, and hoped that the future of Russia was the future of Nemtsov. Unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be. I remember him as a man of principle and great courage. His charm and youthful vigor embodied the hope and promise of what we all thought was a new Russia, looking towards a brighter future. So I'm here today to tell you, as others will, that despite all that's happened over the past year, we're not going to let these hopes die, Mr. Nemtsov's hopes die. We'll not turn away and abandon our friends in Russia, and we do have many friends in Russia. And one day the work and sacrifice of people like Boris Nemtsov and so many others will bear fruit, and Russia will take its rightful place as a modern European state, committed to the values of the rule of law and respect for human rights. It'll happen. People like me who grew up in the Cold War era thought that the Soviet Union would never, ever crumble. And it rotted from inside, and that will happen again in Russia. Under Putin's leadership, that will certainly happen. Mr. Nemtsov was well known and respected here in Congress. His fearlessness in exposing high-level corruption and the truth about Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine is a testament to his true patriotism and an inspiration to his fellow citizens who seek an alternative to the massive theft, violence, and lies that are the true threats to the Russian state. In the end, his enemies feared him far more than he feared them. There's no way that he could have been assassinated where he was, and for the Russian authorities and Putin. Many in Congress are understandably focused on the events in Ukraine, but let us all remember that this war ultimately began in Moscow, not in Kyiv, and will end in Moscow too. Russia's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine is powerful vindication of the truth that how a government treats its own people will inevitably affect its foreign policy. Indeed, our concern about events inside Russia is more than a values-based concern, but a hard national security interest of the United States and caring for the Russian people. Just yesterday, as an expression of my solidarity with Russia's democratic opposition, I joined my colleague Chris Smith, chairman of the U.S. Helsinki Commission, to introduce a resolution honoring the life and work of Boris Nemtsov and recommitting the United States to standing by those in Russia who are struggling against great odds to build a freer, more just, and prosperous future. I hope others will join us on this clear statement of support and friendship from the House of Representatives to the people of Russia. You know, many of us on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I'm ranking member, we've condemned the aggression that Putin has shown. We've condemned the aggression in Crimea. It's interesting to note that many opposition politicians in Russia have not condemned Crimea, have tacitly supported it. But not so with Mr. Nemtsov. He knew aggression when he saw it, he didn't like it, and he condemned it. Not easy for someone in his position at the time to do. So lastly, I want to take this opportunity to extend my heartfelt sympathy to Mr. Nemtsov's family, friends, and colleagues. I see that some of you are here today, and to condemn the regime that has fostered a climate of hatred where murders like this can happen, and happen with impunity. Let me say, I've been in Congress now for 27 years. I've met many, many people, many, many visitors. I've been on the Foreign Affairs Committee for a long, long time. There was something about Boris Nemtsov that stuck in my mind. He was really special. He was unique. He was one of a kind. But I believe that the principles that he espoused will one day take hold in Russia. And we'll never forget him, and we will always remember the work that he did, not only for Russians, but for all people who hate him. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. We were going to have with us today Irwin Cotler, who is a former Justice Minister of Canada, a terrific voice for human rights in Canada, and a close associate of Boris Nemtsov, who brought Nemtsov to the Canadian Parliament in 2012 to the bill in the Parliament. And Irwin couldn't be with us today. He sent a statement, and I want to call on Kyle Parker to read the statement. Kyle, for those of you here who were at the Hudson Institute meeting last night about the new global Magnitsky Act, would have heard Kyle speak about the history and the work on the Magnitsky bill. And, you know, he and members of Congress, Jim Ben Cardin and others, did tremendous work, but probably no staffer did more than Kyle Parker, and we're really delighted today.
Thank you, Carl. It's good to see so many friends of Russia today in this room, friends of Boris Nemtsov, and it's a real honor for me to read this message from Irwin Cotler, who is a real human rights hero on so many issues and for so many decades. Certainly on work in Russia and anti-Semitism and other places. He's a familiar face here in the halls of Congress. I regret that my parliamentary obligations here in Canada prevent me from joining in the symposium honoring the memory of Boris Nemtsov, a heroic figure in the struggle for a democratic Russia. The for Democracy and its President Karl Gershman are to be commended for organizing this symposium. The shocking murder of Boris Nemtsov was and remains a source of deep sadness and pain. Boris was a friend, colleague, and fellow Democrat in arms for us all, a person of unwavering moral courage and commitment, and a leader in the global movement of justice for Sergei Magnitsky. His voice resonated in the halls of Congress and in the European Parliament as it did throughout Russia. During his visit to the Canadian Parliament 3 years ago, he not only supported my Justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation, but inspired us all with his vision of a democratic Russia anchored in the rule of law, an independent judiciary, a free press, and an end to the culture of corruption and impunity. Last month, the Canadian Parliament unanimously adopted a resolution that condemned the detention, torture, and murder of Sergei Magnitsky, along with the related cover-up, called for sanctions against the Russian officials involved, and called for comparable sanctions against human rights violators elsewhere. It was, as I said at the time, a fitting memorial for Boris Nemtsov. One almost felt that he was in the parliamentary chamber with us. May we continue to be inspired by his memory, and may that memory underpin the struggle for democracy in Russia, inspiring the activists, Democrats, human rights defenders, journalists, and many others who will help bring it about. Sincerely, Irwin Cotler.
And then lastly, before we start the panel, Ben Cardin was going to be with us today, but he's managing an Iran bill on the floor in the Senate today, so he couldn't. And so we just received a message from Senator Cardin, which I want to read. Thank you for inviting me to speak in honor of Boris Nemtsov, former Russian Deputy Prime Minister and Russia's fearless and tireless crusader for bringing universal human rights, democracy, and the rule of law to his beloved Russia. Boris was the definition of courage, and I was honored to know him. Due to legislative business on the Senate floor, I'm not able to be with you this morning, but I wanted to share some thoughts on what he can and what we can do to commemorate his legacy. Boris was a partner and ally on the 2012 Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act, groundbreaking legislation that sanctions human rights offenders and those involved in rampant corruption in Russia. I met Boris when I chaired the U.S. Helsinki Commission. In our work at the Commission, we relied on the personal stories of people like Boris who have direct experience in fighting for democracy and human rights and who use their voice to expose corruption and abuse. Boris was an ardent and passionate defender of the most basic rights. The assassins who gunned him down in full view of the Kremlin may have silenced, but the group gathered here today in tribute is testament that they have not silenced his legacy. Last month, I joined a bipartisan group of senators in co-sponsoring a resolution that recognizes Boris's courageous work, calls for a full and transparent investigation into his tragic murder, and urges that more Russian human rights be added to the Magnitsky list, and calls on the president to significantly increase support for like-minded partners in Russia. Further, last December, the Foreign Relations Committee led in the passage of the Ukraine Freedom Support Act, which included enhanced sanctions on Russia as well as support for democracy and human rights defenders. As ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, I will continue to look for further legislative measures. I'm also working with Chairman Corker to secure the Foreign Relations Committee consideration of the Global Magnitsky Act, which I just mentioned. I will also continue to press the administration to add specific names to the Magnitsky. Just last week, my staff provided the administration with a list of names for those who are complicit in the abduction and detention of Nadia Savchenko, the Ukrainian military pilot and member of parliament who remains imprisoned in Russia. While the Putin regime seeks to distract attention from egregious human rights abuses at home and continuing to destabilize Ukraine, we cannot lose sight of how the Russian people have suffered under his regime. Thank you for all of your work to make the promise of a more democratic Russia a reality. That is Boris's legacy, and we have a charge to keep by ensuring that his sacrifice is not in vain. And with that, we're going to get started with our panel this morning. And I'm going to introduce in the order we're going to hear from them now, and then I'm going to join them up on the dais there. We're going to hear from our very good friend Vladimir Kara-Murza, who has just come here from Moscow, and he's the coordinator of Open Russia, which is the platform for democracy activists founded by the former political prisoner Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He was a longtime colleague and advisor to the Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov. Indeed, he considers Boris Nemtsov to be a member of his family. His daughter, Boris Nemtsov, was the godfather of his daughter, and a member of the Federal Council of the People's Freedom Party, which was established by Nemtsov in 2012. After Vladimir, we're going to hear from Lilia Shevtsova, who is now at the Brookings Institute and a prolific author. She was our Lipset lecturer in November, and we published in the January issue of the Journal of Democracy her Lipset lecture, Russia's Political System, Imperialism and Decay. And in the journal, she has another article. There's an issue on resurgent authority, and her article is entitled Forward to the Past in Russia. Our third speaker will be David Kramer, who is the Senior Director for Human Rights and Democracy at the McCain Institute. He was, of course, as everyone knows, formerly the president of Freedom House and Assistant Secretary at the DRL Bureau at the State Department. Leon Wieseltier is the Isaiah Berlin Senior Fellow in Culture and Policy at the Brookings Institution and contributing editor and critic at The Atlantic. And from 2014, he was the literary editor of The New Republic, which he told me I could say this has since imploded. And finally, Natalia, oh, Bill, you're here. Okay. I was going to say you were going to arrive. But I think everyone knows Bill Browder, who really was the spirit behind the Magnitsky Bill. He happened to be in town. And when Natalia Pelavina was detained, and they took all of her office, her computer and so forth, and it prevented her from traveling. She was going to be a panelist today and couldn't come. And when we heard that Bill was in town, we said, well, Bill, why don't you take her place? And I'm sure she's delighted and honored to be taking her place. And of course, Bill has just published his book, Red, the story of his fight for justice for Sergei Magnitsky, who was murdered. And what he has done in Sergei Magnitsky's memory is the course of human rights defense around the world. The Magnitsky Act is a powerful new instrument, but now the Congress is going to be introducing this bill for a global Magnitsky Act, and this is going to help people fighting for human rights around the world. So, Bill, it's great to have you with us. I know you have to leave at 20 after 11 to go to a meeting on China, and where they're considering a Magnitsky list themselves, I want you to know. And you'll talk to them about that. And if you have to, we'll put you further up on the panel so that you can leave by 11:20. And we're going to start with Vladimir.
Carl, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for holding this event. Thank you for all the kind words that were said here today. Thank you for the memory. And it's good to see so many friends here. I participated in a lot of discussions and meetings in this town and here in Capitol Hill. And in very many of them, I participated together with Boris Nemtsov. So it's very difficult today to see his photos, to hear his name, but not to see him here on the podium. I'm not going to repeat all the good words that were said here. I think they speak for themselves. I just mentioned that I never agreed and never will agree with the popular generalization that politics is a dirty business. Because I think politics is only as bad or as good as the people who make it. And it cannot all be a dirty business if it had people like Boris Nemtsov, who always said what he believed and who always did what he said, who never betrayed his friends or his principles, benefited from the many high offices or never profited from the many high offices that he held, his personal interests above the interests of his country, and who chose the difficult path of opposing a dictatorship because it was the right thing to do, instead of settling for comfortable collaboration, as did so many of the so-called Democrats from the 90s. I think it's fair to say that he was the best president that our country never had, gave his normal democratic state. In the days following his murder, and I must say that even to this day, the prevailing feeling for many of my friends and colleagues has been those of despair and hopelessness. And I think that was precisely the intention of those who are behind this. But we have no right to despair, and we have no right to lose hope, as we have no right to stay silent or run away. Because the very least that we owe to the memory of Boris Nemtsov is to continue his work for a freer and a more hopeful Russia, to make sure that those millions of Russian citizens who want a European future for our country have a voice. And we will use all the constitutional and peaceful means at our disposal to make sure that we achieve this. To go out onto the streets and exercise our right to freedom of assembly. Just tomorrow, in fact, on May the 1st, there will be a big opposition march in St. Petersburg, the Democratic March, which was co-organized by a wide coalition of pro-democracy groups from right to left. We will use elections, manipulated, fraudulent, and unfair as they are, as a mechanism, as a means to mobilize our supporters and to send a message to the Kremlin. Just 2 weeks ago, Russia's leading opposition parties, including the party of Boris Nemtsov, Parnas, the People's Freedom Party, and the Progress Party, led by the anti-corruption campaigner Alexei Navalny, as well as many other opposition groups, have joined together to form a united democratic coalition that will contest this year's regional elections, which come in September, and next year's national parliamentary elections as a unified force. This, in fact, is the idea that Boris Nemtsov dedicated the last few months of his life to, and it has now come to life. And in fact, the reason that we currently have ballot access at all and do not need to pass this hurdle of collecting signatures, which the Kremlin always uses to bar its opponents, is because a year and a half ago, 18 months ago, Boris Nemtsov won a legislative seat in a legislature in Yaroslavl, which gives us the right to take part in these elections. It is only our job to bring changes to our country, not anyone else's. So when our friends and partners and colleagues in the democratic world ask us what can they do to help, we always answer the same thing: just be honest and stay true to your principles. 2.5 years ago, the efforts of the people in this room, and I'm talking in particular about Bill Browder and Kyle Parker and many members of the House and the other chamber on the other side of the hill, this country passed a law that for the first time put an end to for those who violate and abuse the rights of Russian citizens by denying them the privilege. It's a privilege, it's not a right. By denying them the privilege of access to the United States and its financial system, a privilege, I have to add, that they so greatly enjoy, the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law and Accountability Act. And I think it's now high time to expand this blacklist of abusers and to add those state television propagandists that work for Vladimir Putin, that use their government podium, the government media, to vilify Boris month after month after month, to denounce him from all the television screens as a traitor, as a member of the fifth column, as an enemy of Russia, for opposing Putin's repression at home and his aggression abroad. And in fact, a few days ago, former Prime Minister Mikhail Kasyanov and I held several meetings here on Capitol Hill, and we gave Congress with whom we met this list that contains 8 people, 8 state propagandists working for Putin state television who are directly responsible for public incitement against Boris Nemtsov. And we're very heartened by the initial positive response. And we hope that these people are recognized for who they are, not journalists, but propagandists and dealers of hate in the service of a dictatorship. As Bill said when he was first talking about the idea of the Magnitsky Act, since we cannot for now achieve justice inside Russia, we have to seek justice on the international level. But I'm sure, I know, that one day we will have justice in Russia. For these dealers of hate, for the killers of Sergei Magnitsky, for those who ordered the murder of Boris Nemtsov, for those others who abused and violated the rights and freedoms of Russian citizens for so many years now. I know we will have this justice, because I know that one day, just as Boris Nemtsov always wanted, and just as the cause that he gave his life to was dedicated to, I know that one day Russia will be free. Thank you.
For that very strong, moving statement. And now, Lilia.
Thank you. I would like to join my friend Vladimir, thanking, first of all, National Endowment for Democracy. Carl. Thank you, your team. And I want to thank the members of Congress and their respective teams for unwavering support of our, as I thought recently, hopeless drive for dignity. But maybe it's not that hopeless at all. And I want to remind that, well, the Russian legislature, the Russian parliament, refused outright to pay tribute to Boris Nemtsov. And the history will remember that. The history never forgets. The history never forgets that you folks in the American Congress hosted this meeting. And a couple of points that could look controversial and paradoxical, but only on the first side. Firstly, on the moment that we are living today. Well, I would argue that interregnum, post-Cold War order, the interval that we lived for nearly 20 years, it's over. It's over because of the Russian annexation of Crimea. It's over because of Russia's undeclared war with Ukraine. It's over because Boris Nemtsov was assassinated, was killed with a blatant impunity. And apparently in future textbooks, Boris' assassination in 2015 will be defined, formulated as a benchmark, because he ended, the whole Russia's history, or maybe in European history, when, the fuzzy lines that existed before, ambivalence of the principles, ungrounded hopes, believe that, that the world history is over because liberal democracy won. So all this ambiguity now is over. Now this assassination has demonstrated the clear and dramatic challenge that we all face. And now even the country over the Atlantic Ocean. Well, and two more points to add. Well, one point, paradoxes. I play with paradoxes, I find it amusing, but now I feel that these paradoxes that we are living through, they're pretty, well, they could be disastrous, although they're hopeful as well. Just one of the paradoxes. Just look at Russia. On the one hand, you see aggressive monster, kicking over the global chessboard, assertiveness towards the neighbors, and recklessness in returning back to the 16th century. But what does it mean? It means that the previous model of existence, of the Russian matrix, of the Russian system of personalized power, one-man rule, is over. It cannot live in a peaceful modality. It can't. It has exhausted its domestic, financial, economic, administrative resources. That's why it turns to solve the problems of the 21st century towards the methods, gimmicks, and tricks of the 16th century. Not work. It doesn't work. This system is not sustainable, even more. And another paradox is that what, the authorities, the Kremlin is doing, it simply, got into action the law of unintended consequences. The more they try to survive, using this, besieged fortress, mobilization, militarist slogan, annexation, recklessness, and killings, the more they undermine themselves. In fact, the system has embarked on a suicidal path. Another very interesting, complicated challenge, but also hopeful. When we look at the Russian society, well, we see this skyrocketing approval rating, wow. And society is silent. Yes, there are sporadic, Tamil strikes, but overall it looks as if it's sleeping. It's not sleeping, because if you scratch the Russian skin a little bit deeper, well, you'll see a totally different reality. You'll see a lot of bumps growing on that could explode at any moment. Just look. Even according to this very strange polls that could be trusted, could be not, but a kind of indicator, 55% of Russians could survive without a state. So, a major part of the society are not paternalistic anymore. 50% of respondents would like to have a real opposition. And moreover, every second Russian would like to support the rallies. This is also a new reality. Well, you'll tell me, well, but you are failing constantly. Yes, we with Vladimir have been failing. Opposition, democratic, liberal opposition has been failing, but this is a kind of failure that looks like a pause, a delay. This is not a defeat. And of course, we'll need a further stamina in order to turn our stumbling blocks into stepping forward. And the final paradox on irony, well, and it's a bitter irony, because for the first time, maybe in the world's history, an alien civilization, and Russia is an alien civilization comparing to the liberal. This civilization survives through what? Through sucking to the West. Before, during the Soviet times, Russia survived, the Soviet Union survived by containing the West and using the West as an enemy to mobilize, incite, and to legitimize its power. It's absolutely strange, amazing way of survival by sucking to the West, by co-opting the Western political and business elite, by personally integrating into the West, by building laundry machine within the Western society that looks like a cancer. And sometimes looking at my people, the enablers, the well, former colleagues in many European capitals, I'm starting to think whether this cancer already spreads through the brain of the European society or not. And apparently for the first time during this history of many decades, the West has powerful means to influence Russia, to have an impact on the rent-seeking elite that sells commodity to the West and survives this way, keeping money in the West, okay? If, for instance, Chancellor Schroeder, under the powerful impact of the European and German public opinion, resigns from his official post as the apparatchik of Gazprom, if the Western media people, Western lawyers, business people, politicians, former politicians, and especially in Europe, but maybe in the United States too, if they start to dismantle the laundry machine that the rent-seeking elite has been building so smartly and such a skillful way in the West, that will be the beginning of the new time. That will be a powerful incentive for the Russian to transform itself, and maybe it will be the end of the Russia's metric. You're looking at me just with a smile in your eyes. Maybe it's a dream, but I can say that I have a dream. And finally, what could, in my eyes, Boris' legacy is? You know, I've been thinking it, how to formulate it in one sentence. And I came to the following conclusion. You know, I believe that just courage could be contagious. So if one brave man, just like Boris, stands up, you know, the spines of the others are stiffened. Thank you.
I'm going to let Bill go now. He doesn't have any anxiety about getting out of here on time. Bill Browder. And Bill, it's just really great to have you with us today.
Well, Carl, thank you, and Ned for inviting me. I really shouldn't be here because the person who should be here is Natalia Pelovina. For those of you who don't know her, Natalia is a Russian citizen, a playwright, an opposition activist, a very good person, and somebody who was instrumental in helping us push for the Magnitsky Act, both in the United States and also pushing for justice in Russia. And as we know, people who push for sanctions against corrupt officials, those who fight the Russian government, end up in trouble. And the fact that she has been that she was arrested, offices were searched, she's been denied the access to leave the country, is more example, but one very personal example to me and many of those around me, that that there's something deeply wrong with what's going on with Russia. I don't want to be sitting in her seat today. She should be able to travel freely to sit here and recognize that. Boris Nemtsov is someone who is also a good friend of mine and a good friend to our efforts to obtain justice for Sergei Magnitsky. I met Boris Nemtsov for the first time shortly after Sergei had been murdered in police custody after government corruption. And as I was seeking justice, there were two types of conversations I had. There were open conversations that I had in Washington with many of the people here in this room, and there were whispered conversations that I had with people in Moscow, because it wasn't popular and it wasn't a safe thing to be fighting for justice for Sergei Magnitsky in Russia. But one of the conversations I had in Moscow with somebody that wasn't whispered was with Boris Nemtsov. He wasn't scared. He wasn't scared to come to our aid, to the aid of Sergei Magnitsky, to the aid of Sergei Magnitsky's family, when it was a deeply unpopular and dangerous thing to do in Russia. And Boris, of things, as was mentioned by many people before me, Washington for sanctions against Russian. He came to Washington to tell everybody that it wasn't, that sanctions against corrupt Russian officials wasn't anti-Russian, it was pro-Russian. He came to Canada, to Ottawa, to do the same thing, as Erwin Kotler mentioned in his statement that Kyle read. He came to Brussels to call for sanctions. He came to London for sanctions. And perhaps bravest of all, he publicly demonstrated with a picture of Sergei Magnitsky in the streets of Moscow. And for that, and for all of that, I am forever indebted. And moreover, he did none of this because anyone asked. He did this because it was the right thing to do. And that impresses me. If I look back on who he was and what he was, and to who everybody else is, it's a remarkable story. Every single other, he was the deputy prime minister in Russia in charge of the oil business when he was in government. Every single other supposed reformer in the government became corrupt and stayed in the government and became billionaires. And that option was open to him, I'm sure, like everyone else. He would have been the perfect system guy, but and the money was probably dangling right there in front of his face, and so for him to take the choice of not being the systems guy, money, and then living a life of truth. And living a life of truth, and a dangerous life of truth, arrested, thrown in jail after each demonstration, is really just the most remarkable. And you only know someone's true character by what they give up, not by and by what kind of risks they take. And the risks that he took were remarkable. Why was he killed? He was killed because he was the most beloved opposition politician. Everybody in every capital of the world, there's not a politician that I know in Washington or anywhere else that doesn't have a picture of them with Boris Nemtsov. He was the most beloved one in the West. He was the one who said that Putin was a billionaire. He was the one who said that there are Russian troops in Ukraine when the Russian government refused to say that. He was the one who said that there should be sanctions for the murderers of Sergei Magnitsky. And the Putin, I'm not going to beat around the bush. Putin didn't want that. And Putin is a man who wants to send a message to everybody. And by killing the most beloved, by killing the man who is bravest, it sends the most powerful message, which is, and killing him in front of the Kremlin with dozens of security cameras sends the most powerful message, which is that we will kill anybody. We will kill anybody. If we can kill Boris Nemtsov, we will kill anybody. And I have to Vladimir and all of his colleagues to be able to, in any context after that, is just an act of unbelievable human strength. And the message was to Vladimir and all of his colleagues not to be in the opposition, because Putin is scared of the opposition right now, because now Russia is going into an economic crisis. Boris Nemtsov, without being asked to fight for justice for Sergei Magnitsky, and I think it's all of our duties now to fight for justice for Boris Nemtsov. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill, for that beautiful statement. David?
Carl, thanks very much, and thanks to you and the NED for putting this together. A very, very fitting tribute to Boris and to the challenge that lies ahead. It's, and Lily has heard me say this before, it's very easy for a crank like me and others to sit in Washington and criticize the Putin regime and all the abuses that take place, the invasion. but it takes tremendous courage to live in Moscow, as you do, as Vladimir does, as others in this room do, and to speak out. We have seen, sadly, what the price people can pay for such courage, for such candor, and Boris has been the latest tragic example of that. Freedom House has, over the years, helped people in Russia as well as elsewhere who sometimes reach a point where they have to leave their country, where the situation for their personal safety no longer allows them to stay. And Boris knew about this program and approached me on several occasions to request help for some of his friends and colleagues. Personally introduced me to several people that he felt the time had reached they needed to get out. One time in 2013, at a conference in Europe, we were together, and he pulled me aside, and he surprised me. He said, "I may need your help." And I was surprised, and he said, "I don't want to leave, but I've been told I'm next." By next, he meant after the Navalny investigation, he had learned that he was going to likely be the next target of investigation. He said, "I don't want to be in prison. No one wants to be in prison, but I also don't want to leave my country." So it was a terrible dilemma for him. And he said, "Don't do anything now." I checked with him last October. We were together at a conference with him in Sweden. And I said, excuse me, any update? He said, "No, it's okay. It's okay. Don't do anything." So I regret not pushing the issue a little more. You know, I've said many times that how a regime treats its own people is often indicative of how it will behave in foreign policy. And we see that Mr. Putin doesn't care about the human rights of his own people. And he pretends to care about ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, whatever phrase he wants to use, to justify the invasion of Ukraine. It's Ukraine today, it was Georgia 2008, it's Estonia even by cyber in 2007. It will be another country if we don't stand up. Boris, as Bill and others have said, was the biggest advocate I knew on the Magnitsky legislation. And what was critically important in his mind was that it was pro-Russian. He said, "This is not anti-Russian." He said, "This is pro-Russian because what you're doing is trying to provide justice from outside." It was targeted, he said, it wasn't against the country. And that was very important. And as Vladimir has said, there's proposals for additions to the list. The list has been far too small. The implementation of it has been too slow. There are sadly many people who need to be added to the list. The hate-mongering that Vladimir and Mikhail have put forward are very deserving to be added. The sanctions on Ukraine are no substitute for the Magnitsky list. These are totally different lists. Ukraine-related sanctions are for the aggression and invasion of Ukraine. The Magnitsky list is human rights abuses committed in Russia, not least, of course, for the tragic murder of Sergei Magnitsky, as Bill talked about. Global Magnitsky passage of that would be a very fitting tribute. It, too, would be targeted. It's not against countries. It's against individuals, and it's to act as a deterrent to individuals to get them think twice before they engage in or are complicit with gross human rights abuses. And in the absence, as Vladimir said, of justice these days in Russia, we have to do what we can to deny, as Lilia was describing, those who like to spend time in the West, put their money in the West, vacation in the West, take advantage of the West, exploit us, corrupt us. We have to stand up for ourselves first and not allow this to happen, and then do what we can to help those who are fighting for the right cause in Russia. The responsibility for his murder, I share Bill's thoughts. This is obviously speculation, as we all know, about the role of Kadyrov. fingers pointing in his direction. But of course, at the end of the day, Putin has created the environment in which this kind of activity is not just condoned, but encouraged. The demonization of critics and opposition figures, of journalists, the fifth column talk. Putin has painted bullseyes on all of these people. And it could take a lone man or it could take a concerted effort for people to follow through on what they think are his wishes. So it is critically important to speak truth to power. And Boris Nemtsov, I think, spoke louder than anyone else did on that. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And you know, when you speak about the absence of justice in Russia, I just want to note that Kyle has given me a copy of this resolution, which is being introduced today by Congressman Engel and Congressman Chris Smith. And it condemns the murder of Boris Nemtsov, offers condolences to the family and friends and colleagues, expresses solidarity with the people of Russia, and calls for an international investigation of this horrible crime. And they call for the participating states of the OSCE to invoke the Moscow mechanism of the OSCE and conduct an international investigation into the circumstances that led to his murder. And that they also call upon the Russian government to establish a commission of inquiry consistent with the UN guidelines to cooperate fully with any international investigation, assessment of Nemtsov's murder. And that we have copies of the resolution here, and we're going to get this around, and hopefully it'll be approved by the Congress very shortly. Leon.
Thank you, Carl. In memory of Boris Nemtsov, not only a hero of his country, but also of what I would call the democratic international, I would like to offer a few general that I have drawn from the horror of his fate. These are all sobering conclusions, but our times are schooling us in a new sobriety about history. We are learning, too, to be more sober about ourselves, about our own role in shaping history in the direction of our professed ideals. But the sobriety that I have in mind about the American role and the Western role in the campaign against contemporary tyranny and savagery is really more akin to disgust. The first conclusion is this: freedom is not to be confused with democracy. Democracy is only one of the things that can be done with freedom. When a dictatorship crumbles, a society is emancipated outwardly, but not yet inwardly. Or to put it differently, when you emancipate a society, you emancipate existing people who comprise that society, their demons as well as their angels. Evil has as much use for freedom's energies and for the opportunities of liberty as good does. We have seen this confirmed in many countries in recent years, but the most repercussive instance of this harsh truth may be Russia in the years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The exhilaration of that once unimaginable liberation has been crushed by the ascendancy of Russia's demons. Where communism once was, there fascism now is, and imperialism. And there is also, once again, a minority of valiant souls who endeavor to combat the new repression, keep the truth alive. The second conclusion is this: there is moral and historical progress, but it is never linear, never direct, never final, and there is nothing inevitable about the emergence of democracy from the ruins of dictatorship. The push forward brings the pull backward, brings the bullets in Boris Nemtsov's back. The much vaunted arc of history bends this way and that, cruelly and benevolently and cruelly again, inconsistently, contradictorily, fitfully, and it provides no grounds for confidence that its ultimate end is justice. If we wish it to bend in a certain direction, we must do the bending. There are always interests and ideas that are ruthlessly dedicated to thwarting the emergence of a liberal order or to its reversal. Historically speaking, liberalism may be essentially and therefore always in need of support and assistance. And the fragility of liberalism imposes an obligation upon all the citizens of all the liberal orders to come to its defense. The cause is one cause. For us, the recognition of our kinship with Democrats and dissenters in other countries, a kinship of values, which is infinitely more admirable than a kinship, should be a matter of honor. And our failure to recognize these affinities and the duties that they demand of us should be a matter of disgrace. The third conclusion is this: outrage without action is just a sanctimonious cynicism. There was in the aftermath of Nemtsov's assassination, just as there was outrage when Putin's wild clients in Ukraine shot a civilian airliner out of the sky. But there were no consequences commensurate with the outrage. The American government now specializes in inconsequential action. Our anger impedes no crime and makes no criminal think twice. This was the case also in Syria and elsewhere. Our president gives evidence of his ethical exquisiteness and then lets the atrocities be. The really striking thing about the sanctions against Putin is that the damage they cause economically does not inhibit him strategically. The billions of Russian weapons and troops pour across the border. Indeed, we, the United States, are the ones with the inhibitions. As in other regions of the world, this is a struggle of inhibited good against uninhibited evil, which is to say, it is hardly a struggle at all. Why wouldn't Putin take Mariupol? Our confusion brings to mind John Stuart Mill's warning, quote, that the profession of the doctrine of non-intervention only by free countries comes to this issue, that the wrong side may help the wrong, it must not help the right. Mill proceeded to comment on a foreign policy crisis of his own time, and his words of 1859 read uncannily as an allegory of 2015. The meaning of the allegory will be immediately clear to you. It might not have been right for England, even apart from the question of prudence, to have taken part with Hungary in its noble struggle against Austria. But when the Hungarians haven't shown themselves likely to prevail, the Russian despot interposed, and joining his force to that of Austria, delivered back the Hungarians to their exasperated oppressors. It would have been an honorable and virtuous act on the part of England to have declared that this should not be, and that if Russia gave assistance to the wrong side, England would aid the right. It might not have been consistent with the regard is bound to pay for its own safety, and to have taken up this position on its own, single-handed. But England and France together could have done it. And if they had, the Russian armed intervention would never have taken place, or would have been disastrous to Russia alone. While all that those powers did by not doing it was that they had to fight Russia 5 years afterwards under more difficult circumstances. The first nation which, being powerful enough to make its voice effectual, has the spirit and the courage to say that not a gun shall be fired in Europe by the soldiers of one power against the revolted subjects of another, will be the idol of the friends of freedom everywhere. The nation which gives will soon find itself at the head of an alliance of free peoples, so strong as to defy the efforts of any number of despots to bring it down. The prize is too glorious not to be snatched sooner or later by some free country, and the time may not be distant when England, if she does not take this heroic part because of its heroism, will be compelled to take it from consideration for her own safety. The fourth conclusion is this: the 20th century is not without lessons for the 21st. The Cold War remains pertinent to the predicament in which we now find ourselves. These days, this is a deeply heretical proposition. Obama denies it because he regards the Cold War as a tragic confrontation in which we, the United States, often behaved badly and from which we emerged with a lamentable sense of triumphalism. Putin denies it because he regards the Cold War as a vast humiliation for Russia that must be, as if the primary beneficiaries of the collapse of the Soviet Union were not the Soviet peoples themselves. The discontinuities of the current situation with the Cold War are, of course, considerable, but there are continuities too. And when we banish the acknowledgement of those continuities from the discussion, we deprive ourselves of moral and strategic wisdom. It is not merely that there are features of Putin's Russia that perpetuate some of the features of Soviet Russia, the regional aggressions, the restoration of propaganda as the central instrument for the shaping of an entire population's picture of the world, the imprisonment and murder of political opponents, the geopolitical paranoia, the obsessive and utterly mendacious characterization of its adversaries and its victims as fascists, and so on. You will say that she was writing at the time of her murder in 2006, Anna Politkovskaya wrote these mordant and macabre words, quote, "I am an incorrigible and amenable to re-education. Some time ago, Vladislav Surkov, Putin's deputy chief of staff, explained that there were people who were enemies but you could talk sense into, and there were incorrigible enemies to whom you couldn't and who simply needed to be cleansed from the political arena." The mixed history of American policy during the Cold War finally demonstrates the necessity and the nobility of taking upon ourselves the burden of a confrontation and rising to the responsibilities of a conflict with which we have already been presented. It demonstrates also the long-term strategic sagacity of siding unequivocally with an oppressed population against an regime, and of standing ringingly with the liberal opposition, not only to give heart to good people, but because these are the people who may one day come to power and attempt to repurpose it in conformity with principles that we share. If, as the administration believes, we were correct in attempting a engagement, surely we will be correct also in admitting that our policy of engagement has failed. Do we wish to honor the memory of Boris Nemtsov? Then let us be honest about the grimness of the situation in which we find ourselves. Do we wish to honor the memory of Boris Nemtsov? Then let us show our contempt in word and in deed for the dictator and the dictatorship that is responsible for his murder. Do we wish to honor the memory of Boris Nemtsov? Then let us stop searching for an off-ramp for Putin and find an on-ramp for ourselves. Do we wish to honor Boris Nemtsov? Then let us send dollars and weapons to our friends and our comrades in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Leon, for that very stirring talk. We now have some time for discussion. I want to first call on one of our friends who is sort of staying on the sidelines as a backup if Vladimir or someone else didn't show. He is now a Reagan-Fussell Fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy, and he's also Associate Professor of International Relations and Political Science and Human Rights at St. Petersburg State University, and is one of the leading specialists in Russia on xenophobia, ultra-right nationalism, hate crimes, and hate speech. Dima, just take Bill's seat. Just come up here. And push the button.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. It is a big privilege for me to sit here and to speak in the memory of. And as a part of the civil society and as a part of academic world from Russia, I believe that what we really need to commemorate Boris Nemtsov is to create the Boris Nemtsov as a substantial part of our liberal and democratic memory. So what we have done with the Galina Starovoytova, what we unfortunately didn't do with my friend and colleague who was killed up to 10 years ago in St. Petersburg, Nikolai Gerenko, who was killed as a scientific fellow, who is a research fellow who worked in the cases on anti-terrorism and counter-Nazis movement in Russia. But about the civil society, about the failure of I would say, the deep crisis of the democracy and human rights in Russia. But I would say that my personal fear is, from my understanding, maybe the political movement, the democratical movement in Russia, very much to over-centralize to the Putin as a personality. I'm afraid that we are facing the little bit different challenge. And I would say this challenge occurred in the late 90s when the Putin's regime started as Putin itself as a result of common expectations, I would say. And these common expectations, from my understanding, was very much related to what I call postponed Weimar syndrome of Russian Federation, of Russian citizens. Because what I am right now Putin representing, I am afraid this is exactly what the substantial amount of population would like to hear from the leader of the country. The biggest catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of Soviet Union. Not the Second World War, not the Holocaust, but the collapse of Soviet Union. So that seems to me the sign why, from my understanding, the civil society right now should find the relevant agenda, relevant language, relevant discourse to speak with the majority of population. I am a little bit afraid what we really need to do for now, to a little bit turn our interest in even, I would say, our agenda in our regular work. Because what sometimes I'm visiting the different cities of Russia, which is quite far, or sometimes not quite far from Moscow and St. Petersburg. I do see the people who are living in the Union. So what we in Russia, I'm afraid we're living in the different, sometimes a different social time. And if you're going through the cities, sometimes through the Russia, you can see the people who are still living in more or less the Soviet Union. Well, some banners, some official titles has been changed, but the feelings, the understandings that, well, for example, anti-American sentiments, they're more or less the same. They refer to the same arguments. But my favorite example is that till now, that even academics seriously refers to the Allen Dulles plan as a substantial and scientific resource in the political studies, which is, by the way, the good sign of the serious political and, academics in lives in Russia. And so what I would like to underline, it seems to me Mikhail Khodorkovsky wrote once about the left turn we really need in current Russian politics, democratic story. So I have no time to discuss that, but what we really need in civil society and academics to be more careful about the real understanding of the majority of Russian population. So what we really need to find the common language, to develop the relevant discourse, to speak with the majority of the population living in the more or less in this Soviet world. Thank you.
Okay. We have a chance for discussion and questions, and the panel, if anybody wants to respond to what was just said or anything else, please, Harley. And introduce yourself for the benefit of everyone else.
I'm Harley Balzer from Georgetown University. I guess I'd like to pick up on three things said by the panelists, particularly Leon's injunction that action isn't worth very much, and Dima's invocation of Galina Starovoitova. Her murder was almost 18 years before that of Boris. Boris was a good acquaintance. Galia was a very close friend. Her murder provoked a lot of discussion among the opposition about the need to really consolidate and do something. Not much really happened. I think the most fitting memorial we could think about to Boris would be something like the Polish Round Table. People talk about solidarity all the time. The Round Table was really the political mechanism that made it possible for the Polish elite to be ready for their opportunity. And this is a case where America really can help. Freedom House Foundation, MacArthur, other foundations really could provide the financial support and even the opportunity to meet not only inside Russia but outside. And it could even be called the Nemtsov Initiative. But to me, that would be a genuine, practical memorial to Boris and something that might help Russia fragmentation in the opposition that came after Galya's murder and might make his much more of a landmark. Thank you.
Of course, Harley, you know, the roundtable in Poland was the Polish opposition and the Polish government, not just the Polish opposition, and not clear that Putin government is prepared to participate.
So half the round table.
Half a roundtable. All right.
The opposition really did consolidate.
If anybody, you know, in the panel wants to comment on any comments that are made from the audience, free to, but the floor is open to questions too.
Comment. Harley, this was my favorite idea, at least through the 90s, round table. My favorite. I saw Solidarity for 10 years over there. But the problem is that Poles had an idea, the hatred of Russia, and they decided to escape from the Russian pocket. And the authorities and all political segments, liberals, nationalists, etc., were united by this idea. The problem is that this kind of idea is lacking in Russia. We cannot escape Russia. This is firstly. And secondly, before apparently doing a round table, we liberals have to consider ourselves. And maybe we'll do the crisis deepens. Crisis is a powerful instrument to force us to get together.
Okay. Vladimir, you've just written about that. You want to, how...
Well, just a quick comment, and also to what
Nemtsov's murder.
to what Harley said. You mentioned the murder of Galina Starovoyeva in November '98, and of course after that, it was that tragedy that served as the main impetus for the creation of the unified democratic movement then, SPS, the Union of Right Forces, which get together, which did get into the State Duma in the '99 elections, and which Boris Nemtsov led as the parliamentary opposition until 2003. For some reason, unfortunately, it always takes, you know, tragedies of this kind to force people to do something. So we'll see what happens out of this coalition. We'll see the first results in September when the first, regional polls are that I mentioned earlier. It's just times people said, I don't know, we have to unite. It always takes these kinds of things to really force people to do it. Or like Lilia said, a crisis, which is coming.
Chris Walker? Why don't you take the mic?
Oh, of course, on the podium.
So just following up briefly on something Lilia mentioned, is the metastasizing of Russia's influence into Western United States. And apart from legislation that demands or requires certain action or certain behavior to stop, which is a part of it, but I would suggest it's insufficient. What else has to happen in the West to properly address the problem that's emerged? For anyone who would like to respond.
David is responsible for that.
I wasn't aware. Chris, I would say a lot of this does have to do with us. It's about the integrity of our systems. It's about transparency. It's about disclosure. One of my pet in this city is people who write articles, give speeches, and don't disclose that they have certain interests that might affect their views. Maybe they don't, but who don't fully disclose who they are, what they represent. And I would argue Putin's greatest export is corruption. And in order to export something, you have to import it. And we've been importing it for years. And it's time to put out, to abuse this metaphor, some real import controls. And the corruption coming from Russia. And we, as you know better than I, some of the countries closer to Russia than we have a huge problem in this area. And but we are not immune to it either. The Times story, a couple months ago about the investments in the U.S., the real estate purchases. We have some cleaning up of our own to do here, and it requires organizations that engage in promoting and pushing transparency and accountability. And there needs to be a lot more of that, and we need to encourage other countries to do it as well.
But, you know, look, the decisive thing that needs to be done is aiding Ukraine. I mean, if Ukraine can succeed, and I'm just Ukraine, and the determination that I saw there was very, very, but, you know, they need help. They may succeed even without the help, and they're not going to beg for it because they're very, very proud, but they deserve the help. I think this is what Leon was talking about. The fact that they're not getting it sufficiently is disgraceful. And if they do get it, and if they win, I mean, I think the implications for Russia, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. The implications for Russia are very, very profound. I mean, maybe it's simplistic for me to say that, but if Ukraine wins, Putin loses.
Okay. I just want to add that I think that one of the saddest facts today in the world today is that many good people in many countries and the fate of many democratic movements now awaits the debate about the principles of American foreign policy that Americans are going to have. I think that that we have now maneuvered ourselves into a foreign policy that is opaque as to its principles and full of drift. And unless maybe the presidential campaign will have something to do with this, but one must never count on presidential campaigns to clarify or raise the level of any discussion. But I, the United States, we have to have a conversation with ourselves about what the role of the United States in the world, and that conversation is long overdue. And when we clarify those principles to ourselves, and I'm not optimistic about this, many of the good people we're talking about may find themselves with more effective friends in the West now.
Can I just add one other thing? Last September 17th, I think it was both a very proud day for Ukraine and a very sad day. It was proud because Petro Poroshenko delivered a speech before a joint session of Congress that I thought was a great speech. In it, of course, was the famous line about you can't fight bullets with blankets. That was in the morning. In the afternoon, Poroshenko went to the Oval Office, met with the president, and got a lecture. The president told him, don't try to box me in, don't pressure me by doing that in public. Poroshenko could not have come to Washington and not asked for that assistance. Maybe you could argue he shouldn't have come, knowing what the answer was going to be. I was in Kiev 3 days later and met with the prime minister and with Poroshenko's then foreign policy advisor, and all they were worried about the damage that Poroshenko might have done to the Ukrainian-U.S. relationship. Terrible message to leave Ukraine. Not that we are there for you, we support you, but that they might have done harm to the relationship.
I remember when we were in Ukraine in May, there was a very poignant moment at a meeting with some Ukrainian friends in which I found myself saying to them that the Europe membership in which they are risking everything is not prepared to lift a finger for them. And this is a genuinely heartbreaking situation.
Well, you know, this is an extraordinary situation that we're in right now. And, you know, you talk about this debate that we're going to have. I'll tell you my own personal view, and it is something that I believed, you know, when I was much younger during the Vietnam period and the U.S. was reeling from the defeat in Vietnam, and so many people had given up on the whole idea of, you know, a strong foreign policy. The Cold War consensus had broken down. And I looked at what was happening with Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov, and I say, they are going to inspire us. They are going to bring us back to reality. And this is a harsh thing to say, but I think it's people like you, Vladimir, and your courage and what you stand for, and also the people in Ukraine, where they're prepared to die for these values. The West doesn't care anymore, and I don't see how the West can revive its understanding and commitment to these values without the model and the inspiration and the consequences of what you are doing and what others are doing in that part of the world and elsewhere, and in Russia and in Ukraine. It's just that's where it's going to come from. Maybe it'll influence a few people here, Leon.
Save us, please.
Well, that's just the way it works. We live in a integrated world, and what you're doing could have some influence here, I hope. An interesting discussion, but the audience is invited, if you would like, to take part in it or to ask a question. Yes. you can come up through the center and get that mic, or you can go there.
Yes, hello, my name is Anna Dobrovolska, and back in Russia I'm a colleague of Dmitry Dubrovsky. I'm a human rights defender myself also. I would like to thank you for this discussion, and I find it also very interesting and very encouraging what is being discussed. And just a very small comment to bring here. To my mind, yes, it is great that we also bring some kind of Magnitsky Acts and similar sanctions, but I would also bring discussion a bit back and ask a question if you think it can also influence even more if United States and other countries and institutions would be more influencing the energy and ideas to promotion of existing universal standards and institutions we have like UN, Council of Europe, OSCE. Maybe you can see also, this is my question, maybe you see also some kind of instruments which were not yet have been used to influence also the conflict in Ukraine and the situation which we have in Russia. Like the Moscow mechanism of OSCE was mentioned here, so maybe you can have what could be done. Thank you.
David?
I mean, in fact, I think Kyle can correct me if I'm wrong. I think you were the one actually who thought of the Moscow mechanism for an international investigation into the assassination of Boris. So that is a vehicle we could use for this. The problem with some of the other organizations, however, that you mentioned, the UN, of course, Russia exercises veto power. Council of Europe, I'm sorry to say, is not overflowing with integrity, let's put it that way. And the OSCE is a well-intentioned organization that we need to help rebuild. I think tremendous people who work in it, the Helsinki Commission, of course, I saw Orist here, and others. It's a critical organization, but Russia has been spending years trying to destroy it too, at least the human dimension basket. I would argue, at the end of the day, there's no substitute for U.S. leadership. I think the administration has gotten its goals mixed up when it has come to dealing with Russia. The goal is not unity with the EU. Unity with the EU is a tactic. It's a means. It's a mechanism to accomplish our goal. Our goal should be getting Russia out of Ukraine, forcing it to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. If we can do that with the EU, great. I don't know anybody who's opposed to unity with the EU, but sometimes getting agreement among 28 states is a hell of a lot more difficult, or at least it should be, than getting agreement inside one government, the U.S. And I fear we've been hiding behind this goal of unity with the EU as an excuse not to demonstrate U.S. leadership. And given the extraterritorial nature of U.S. sanctions, we underestimate the impact our steps and our measures can have.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
You know, in fact, you raised a question that has no answer and no solution at the moment, because the Security Council and the whole UN structure, the outcome of the Second World War, well, is the only international arena where at least some can play, and Security Council is paralyzed totally and will be paralyzed on most important issue. But how to get rid of the UN and Security Council? That's the question. And the second question, the Kremlin has been using very skillfully the globalization and open borders, undermining the principles from inside. In fact, the Kremlin has succeeded to undermine Parliamentary Assembly, the Council of Europe. Well, that, probably turned into retirement house, okay? But the other alternative is to create the institutions only for liberal democracies, and liberal democracies, because they are not ready to isolate Russia. They've been afraid of isolated Russia even more than of Russia being part of the Council of Europe. That's, that's a puzzle, that's a trap.
Well, Lilia, I would go even further and say that the futility of the UN and other international institutions has been one of the premises of the American involvement in those institutions. That is to say, if you want to know how long the United States intends to do nothing, just look at how long the United States continues to insist that action must happen within the framework of these international institutions. They are running into for an administration that would prefer inaction, and they provide the best cover possible.
So it's leading from behind, so 10 steps from leading from behind?
Oh, it's not
It's
leading,
even
and
more.
it's not leading, and it's not behind.
It's even
That's right, it's some other metaphysical condition.
Maybe the New Republic will write about it. I don't know.
What's that, a magazine? What's that?
It seems like wasn't it Samantha Power talking about the same problem, who called it.
That's right.
It wasn't the failure of a policy, it was the success of a policy that dare not speak its name.
Well, that's right. That's right. I mean, in Syria, certainly the UN has been a godsend to Obama.
Anybody else? Yes, please. You can, and I see a hand there. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Arkady Gutnikov from St. Petersburg Institute of Law, also colleague of Mr. Dubrovsky, a very long time. I just attract your attention and ask you maybe to comment briefly. One word has not been mentioned here in the discussion. It's related maybe not to immediate response to such a dramatic event like killing of Boris Nemtsov, but for long-term strategy. It's a term, the word education. As an educator, I'm interested of your comments on this thing. I believe, first, democratization can come from the top, from the institutional one, but real liberalization, from my point of view, can come only from the bottom, from changing their people mind and beliefs, and it's a serious transition, need to long educational efforts. My question is if, do you see a mechanism, long-term strategy, what we should do together in this field, education, of creating the people's demand of freedom, demand of liberty from the public, not from the politician and elite or people who already participate. So how to change this majority's expectation? The second question, it's also related to education. Should we educate people to use the word experience from other countries of transition mechanism, and can we introduce some peaceful mechanisms of transition, the same, like round table, but not only round table. But for example, it relates to expectation of the Russian elite, of the authority. What could be their future? Is it only lustration and imprisonment? Or could it be some sort, I can imagine the reaction, but some sort of, experience of Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa. I know it's very controversial, but this is another topic. So can we discuss this long-term strategy of transition as a point? And last one.
Try to wrap it up because there's somebody else that wanted. I mean, the question is not, unrealistic. It's maybe delusional. Go ahead.
Maybe. And the question is, do you think? What is your reaction for? Imagine that current authority disappeared. Imagine all people from the list of Magnitsky and global list of Magnitsky disappear. Do you know we have enough capacity, intellectual capacity, to replace them? We will replace them. Should we, as a part of educational efforts, put attention on preparing professionals in different areas, not to repeat mistake, from my point of view, error on beginning of 90s, when there was no enough professionals to take responsibility.
Okay, we had one more question in the back, and then we'll let anybody who wants to comment. Please, go ahead.
George Washington University and Georgetown University. A question for the whole panel about the upcoming Russian celebration of the victory in World War II. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on what the best way for the U.S. and its European allies and partners would be in relation to that. For example, does participation legitimize Russia's current policies? Can those two things be separated, the victory celebration and what is going on with internal repression and Ukraine?
Okay, anybody who wants to comment on either of those two, please take the opportunity now. We're going to try to wrap up certainly by noon, but not before.
Let's go first.
Huh? Yeah.
Just very briefly on Arkadiy's question, I actually take the opposite view of the early 90s. I think we had too many of the old so-called professionals from the KGB, from the communist apparatus, who were not lustrated, who were never, uncovered for who they were. We did have the Constitutional Court decision that the communist regime was a criminal one, which was issued on October the 30th, 1992, but it didn't have any real consequences. It was this, I really like this phrase, outrage without consequences, you said. So I think we better not make this mistake again. If you look at the experience of Central and Eastern Europe, which did cleanse themselves of these old people complicit in the crimes of the regime, and we didn't, and look where we got just 8 years after 1991, when the KGB officer came back to the Kremlin. So I think it's the opposite, but it's definitely, there's definitely an issue of preparing the replacements. So I think that's where you're absolutely right about the education. And on the anniversary of the war victory, just one quick comment. Putin likes to say that he's put Russia back up from its knees, that he made it back into a great power. The 50th anniversary of the victory in World War II in 1995, we had the leaders of the United States, France, of Great Britain, and all the major powers of the world standing alongside President Yeltsin on Red Square. Next week, we will have the leaders of, I believe, Botswana, Nicaragua, South Ossetia, and the likes. And that's the best comment on Putin's claims to have restored our great power status.
Yeah, briefly. About the Arkady question about the possible peaceful mechanism. I understand the murder of Boris Nemtsov is the one of the result. There is substantial amount of that kind of opportunities was filled. It's for these substantial part of the elite after the Boris Nemtsov murder. There is no way for now to think, to dream about this kind of the scenario. And about this 70 years of the Russian victory, that's keeping in mind the current propaganda in Russia. Because I have a bad habit to look on the Russian TV every day, professionally. That is the interestingly juxtaposing between all the and the news from the celebration of the 70th century. That's exactly what I'm speaking about, the Weimar syndrome, because they're always the news from Ukrainian front juxtaposes the reports from the 70 years, because this is the eternal battle against the Western enemies. So we are celebrating the victory of we will won again. So for what's going on right now from the perspective of Russian propaganda in Ukraine. So that seems to me very important to slice this. If the kind of recommendation, seriously slice the current situation and the situation at 70 years of the victory in the Second World War.
Okay, just very briefly. I love the word education. Well, such a hopeless word. But in Russia, it seems to me the demand for liberty will come not through education and not through us educators, but through understanding by the ordinary people that their interests are not being pursued by the system. And when they understand it, maybe we'll have possibility to educate after the current educational system. Regarding the elite, well, it seems to me for the first time in the Russian history, this is the elite stupid. The society is much more ready for change, for normal life. In fact, Russians, first time in the Russian history, consumption objects. Russians have no traditional values. Russians are nice. The problem is how to glue them within the rule of law pattern, and they're ready. They're ready for normal life, for normal roads, for normal health system, education, etc. The problem is that the elite is not ready. This is the elite stupid. And the problem is whether the crisis will be the powerful instrument that will get this Titanic, to its resolution, to its final chapter. If not, then revolution with all unpredictable consequences for Russia.
Well,
I would just say that about World War II, it just might be worth pointing out, not very subtly, that the Second World War was fought to stop imperialism and overthrow fascism, and just wink after that. I mean, it should be clear. Yes.
Well, I think we're gonna wrap it up because I know David has to run. there have been some very wonderful things said today about Boris Nemtsov, about his courage and about living in truth, and it seems to have inspired or motivated the Russian opposition to come together now, and I only hope that it will maybe push Americans and to return to our fundamental principles, because if we don't, this is going to be a very, very difficult struggle to win. Thank you very much all for coming.